Listed like any other was the Creole household in the 1883 territorial census for Bitterroot Valley. One wife, one husband, acreage under cultivation. Neat was the enumerator's handwriting, his columns properly aligned, his figures adding up exactly as federal guidelines required. What he didn't record was the 3 additional beds in the main cabin, each positioned at equal distance from the fourth. What he didn't note was how Prudence Creel answered the door wearing a different brother's jacket than the one visible through the window a moment before. What he didn't mention was the rotation schedule posted inside the barn, marking weeks in 4 different hands. A conventional frontier marriage was what the official record showed. Was this bureaucratic blindness, or something the community chose not to see? Before we dive into the story, Happy New Year is what I want to say to all my amazing subscribers and fans. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from today and what time it is right now. Let's continue with the story, but first check if you're already subscribed to this channel. You won't want to miss our exclusive investigations into America's darkest family secrets that mainstream media refuses to cover. Hit subscribe now to join our community of truth seekers. 4 brothers and 1 woman traveling west together were listed on the land claim filed in Helena in the spring of 1882, though the relationship between them remained unspecified in the official paperwork. 29 had been Jonas Creel when he stood in the Territorial Claims Office. Arranged behind him like steps on a staircase were his 3 younger brothers. 27 was Daniel, Thomas 24, and Silas barely 21. The routine question about marital status had been asked by the clerk processing their homestead application, and with practiced precision Jonas had answered. Married, he was. His wife would be joining them. Accordingly, the clerk had marked the register, and never thought to ask about the other 3 men who would also be living with Mrs. Creel. From Ohio had the brothers arrived in Montana Territory, where their father's death had left them with a modest inheritance and a complicated problem. Barely enough to establish a subsistence farm would be given to each man by dividing the money 4 ways. A substantial claim in the territories could be secured by pooling their resources, where land was cheap and labor was the true currency. But continuous occupation of homestead claims was required by territorial law, and 4 bachelors working separate parcels would struggle to meet those requirements while also generating income. With the same practical efficiency they applied to crop rotation and equipment maintenance had their solution been calculated. They would file as a single household, pull their inheritance, and share one wife who would establish the domestic presence federal law required while the brothers worked the land. Their property unified, their resources concentrated, and their claim legally sound would be kept by the arrangement. 3 months of careful inquiry in mining towns and railroad camps where conventional options were scarce had taken finding a woman willing to accept such terms. 24 had been Prudence Keatering, widowed less than a year and facing the particular desperation of frontier women without male protection. Debt she couldn't pay and skills the Montana economy didn't value was what her husband had left her with when he died in a timber accident. When Jonas Creel had outlined his proposal in a boarding house parlor in Missoula, with the careful attention of someone evaluating a business contract she had listened. Specific had been the terms. To satisfy territorial marriage law, she would be legally married to Jonas, the eldest. For all 4 brothers she would maintain a household, rotating her domestic and intimate attentions on a weekly schedule to be determined by mutual agreement. Considered legitimate heirs to all 4 men equally with inheritance rights to the entire undivided property would be any children born. Financial security, a substantial home, and legal protection of her position she would have in exchange. 2 additions had Prudence negotiated before accepting. First, that without interference she would maintain authority over all household decisions. Second, that financial compensation proportional to the years she had fulfilled the contract she would receive if she chose to leave the arrangement. Both terms had the brothers agreed to. Before a justice of the peace in Helena had Jonas and Prudence stood 3 weeks later while his 3 brothers waited outside. Nothing unusual did the marriage certificate record. For miles distant was the nearest neighbor in the valley where the homestead they established sat, and twice yearly if the weather permitted did the territorial marshal make visits. A substantial cabin with their pooled resources did the brothers build, designed with 4 separate sleeping quarters radiating from a central common room where Prudence would maintain the household hearth. The truth that legal documents concealed was told by the architecture. For more than a year had the Creole household been operating by late 1883, when the census enumerator made his rounds. With the flexibility that frontier communities applied to survival strategies that didn't directly threaten their interests had the valley absorbed the unusual arrangement. Productive farmers who paid their bills and caused no trouble were the brothers. Adequately housed and fed appeared Prudence. Its proper paperwork showing a legally married couple fulfilling homestead requirements had the territorial government. Less than 30 minutes at the Creole property had been spent by the enumerator who visited in August of 1883. 1 husband, 1 wife, 0 children as yet did his notes record. Appropriate to a successful operation were the 160 acres under cultivation, livestock holdings. His questions he had asked, his answers received, and moved on to the next claim. Identical to a dozen others in the valley looked the census page for the Creole household. The larger truth that everyone in Bitterroot Valley understood, but nobody felt compelled to document officially was what the records didn't capture. In an arrangement that violated conventional morality, but solved practical problems did 4 men share 1 wife. Faster than traditional institutions could address did the frontier create. From frontier improvisation wasn't born the Creole arrangement, but from months of careful planning before the brothers ever left Ohio was revealed by letters in the trunk discovered in a Missoula estate sale in 1947. The false bottom while examining the trunk's construction had been noticed by a historian purchasing household items for a regional museum. A bundle of correspondence wrapped in oilcloth lay beneath it, preserved well enough that the ink remained legible after 65 years. Conversations between the 4 Creole brothers during the winter of 1881, a full year before they filed their Montana land claim, was documented by the letters. Evidence of systematic planning that transformed 4 men's economic desperation into a domestic contract unlike anything territorial law anticipated was what emerged from those pages. From Jonas to his brother Daniel came the earliest letter in the collection dated December of 1881. The fundamental problem facing them after their father's death was outlined in it by Jonas. $1,200 had the Ohio farm sold for, which divided 4 ways, gave each brother $300. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. Maybe 40 acres of marginal land could that sum secure, equipment so worn it would fail within seasons, and no buffer against the crop failures that destroyed small operators with reliable frequency. An alternative did Jonas's letter propose. Pool everything, claim significant acreage out west where land was cheap, operate as a unified economic unit. The question Jonas had apparently avoided in his initial proposal was raised by Daniel's response, preserved in the same bundle. How would 4 bachelors maintain a homestead claim that required continuous domestic occupation? Bachelor households as legitimate settlers weren't recognized by territorial law. Vulnerable to challenge by any married couple who wanted their land would be their claim without a wife establishing proper domesticity. In a letter from Thomas dated January of 1882 did the solution appear. 1 wife was what they needed if the problem was the requirement for 1 wife. Not 4 wives dividing resources, but a single woman who understood she would be maintaining a household for 4 men. Remarkably detailed in outlining how such an arrangement might function was Thomas's letter. A rotation schedule ensuring equal time with each brother. Clear financial terms guaranteeing the woman's security. Legal marriage to the eldest brother to satisfy territorial law with private contracts ensuring the others maintained equal domestic rights. How methodically the brothers had worked through logistics before ever approaching a potential wife was what made the correspondence particularly revealing. Architectural drawings showing how a cabin could be designed with 4 separate quarters arranged around a central common room had been contributed by Silas, the youngest. His designated space would each brother have. The communal areas would the woman maintain. His quarters would she share during each man's scheduled week while the others remained in their own. With the same practical efficiency applied to crop rotation did Daniel's letters address the question of children. Considered legitimate heir to all four brothers equally with full inheritance rights to the undivided property would be any child born. The problem of succession was solved by this while avoiding the legal complications that would arise from trying to determine biological paternity. Intact would the land pass to the next generation, regardless of which brother had actually fathered which child. How to present the arrangement to potential candidates had the brothers debated, as revealed by the correspondence. For complete transparency, argued Jonas, believing that women desperate enough to consider the offer would appreciate honest terms. Emphasizing the financial security and legal protections built into the contract was suggested by Thomas. Interestingly, Silas was the one who insisted that any woman accepting such terms must be given genuine authority over household decisions. Concerned that without such power, the arrangement would collapse into chaos as four men competed for domestic priority was shown in his letters. Complete was the planning by March of 1882. Their departure from Ohio, their search for suitable land, and their subsequent discreet inquiries about women in circumstances desperate enough to consider unconventional arrangements was documented by the letters. From Jonas to a brother back in Ohio came the final letter in the collection, dated April of 1882. Brief it was. Their land they had found. Their wife they had found. As planned was the arrangement proceeding. That the Creole household wasn't an impulsive frontier adaptation, but a carefully constructed response to economic realities that territorial law hadn't anticipated was what the letters made clear. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. A system that kept their capital concentrated, their land claims secure, and their domestic requirements satisfied within the technical boundaries of legal marriage had been designed by four men with limited resources. As a practical necessity rather than a moral complication was treated the fact that it required one woman to fulfill intimate obligations to four men in the correspondence. To the Montana Historical Society were the letters donated by the historian who discovered them, where they remained in archival storage for another 20 years before researchers began examining them as evidence of frontier marriage practices that existed outside conventional documentation. One of the few written records showing how some frontier families constructed alternatives to traditional domestic arrangements when survival required flexibility that law and custom didn't provide became the Creole correspondence. Planning and logistics were revealed by the letters. What they didn't capture was how the arrangement actually functioned once Prudence Kettering became Prudence Creole and four men began sharing a wife on a schedule as regular as harvest rotation. Not conceived had Prudence by the spring of 1885, 2 full years after the Creole household began operating under its unusual arrangement, and beginning to fracture under biological uncertainty was the brothers' careful economic planning. To produce heirs who would secure the land claim and continue the unified operation into the next generation had been the entire purpose of their shared marriage. Proof of permanent settlement was required by territorial homestead law and nothing demonstrated permanence like children raised on the property. Vulnerable to legal challenges from married couples who could argue that 4 bachelors sharing domestic space didn't constitute genuine family settlement, regardless of what their marriage certificate claimed, remained the Creole claim without offspring. That in July of 1885, Jonas Creole brought his wife to see Dr. Abraham Thornley, one of only 3 physicians serving the entire Bitterroot region, is revealed by medical records discovered in the archives of the Montana Pioneer Society. 6 separate examinations of Prudence over the following 14 months are documented by Thornley's patient notes preserved in remarkable detail for the era. How completely 19th-century medical science failed to understand human reproduction beyond the most basic mechanical observations is what those notes reveal. A healthy woman of 26 years showing no obvious physical impediments to conception was how Thornley's first examination note described Prudence. Observations about her general constitution, her monthly cycles, and her reported intimate relations with her husband were included in his assessment. With a diagnosis that reflected the medical consensus of the era did the note conclude, female hysteria, potentially preventing successful conception. Dietary restrictions, enforced bed rest during certain phases of her cycle, and a tonic containing compounds that modern analysis would identify as having no reproductive effect whatsoever were included in his recommended treatment. Any examination or evaluation of the 4 men with whom Prudence was actually sharing intimate relations was what Thornley's notes never mentioned. Primitive beyond recognition that intimate contact was required remained medical understanding of male contribution to conception in 1885. Rarely considered by frontier physicians whose training consisted primarily of apprenticeships with other doctors equally ignorant of reproductive biology was the possibility that male factors might prevent pregnancy. Increasing frustration as his treatments produced no results is shown by Thornley's notes from subsequent visits. More extreme interventions had he begun suggesting by his fourth examination in November of 1885. His recommendation for what he termed corrective procedures is mentioned in one note, though he provided no details about what such procedures would entail. His suggestion that Prudence might benefit from consultation with a specialist in San Francisco, a journey that would have cost more than the brothers' entire annual profit and taken Prudence away from the household for months, is referenced in another note. Something else as well is revealed by the medical records. Questions that her doctor found inappropriate had Prudence herself begun asking. That she should not concern herself with medical theories beyond her understanding is recorded in one note as his admonishment. Her inquiry about whether examinations of her husband might be beneficial, a suggestion Thornley dismissed as unnecessary, given that Jonas had demonstrated his capacity for intimate relations, is mentioned in another. Standard medical thinking at the time was the doctor's assumption that performance equaled fertility. But what he never questioned isn't what he examined, but the most revealing aspect of Thornley's notes. That the woman before him was being intimate with 4 different men on a rotating schedule apparently never considered Thornley, despite being told that Prudence maintained a household for 4 brothers, despite the Valley's general awareness of the Creel arrangement. To her husband, singular, did his notes refer consistently, as though the conventional marriage certificate told the complete story. Significant consequences did this blindness carry. The statistical probability that 4 men would all be equally fertile might he have considered if Thornley had understood the true nature of the household. Factors that his examination of Prudence could never reveal might he have identified if he had examined even one of the brothers. For conditions she didn't have did he continue treating her instead, while the actual source of the household's childlessness remained completely unexamined. Within profound ignorance about human reproduction did territorial medical practice in the 1880s operate. But heaviest on women did that ignorance fall. Extensive lists of female disorders to diagnose and treat did frontier doctors have when conception failed. Neither the knowledge to recognize the problem nor the willingness to challenge assumptions that made women's bodies the default location for reproductive failure did those same doctors have when male factors might be involved. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. More than a year of medical interventions that ranged from useless to actively unpleasant had Prudence endured by early 1886. That he had begun suggesting the problem might be beyond medical correction is shown by Thornley's notes from his final recorded examination in March of that year. Exactly where 19th-century medicine consistently located it, with the woman who had somehow failed in her biological purpose, did a diagnosis that placed ultimate responsibility for childlessness place it. That 4 men sharing one wife didn't increase the probability of conception if 3 of those men were incapable of fathering children in the first place was what neither Thornley nor the Creel brothers apparently considered. As mysterious to frontier medicine as the biology that produced it remained the mathematics of fertility. In November of 1886, 3.5 years after their arrangement began, did Prudence Creel give birth to a son, and impossible to ignore suddenly became the question the brothers had agreed never to ask. As William Jonas Creel, son of Jonas and Prudence Creel, born at home with attendance by a local midwife, was listed the child on the birth record filed with the territorial registrar. To hundreds of other frontier birth records was the documentation identical. Straightforward, minimal, revealing nothing about the complications lurking beneath the surface of legal parentage. A different story about the tensions that emerged once the Creel household finally produced its long-awaited heir is told by family correspondence preserved in private collections. The immediate question that arose after the birth is revealed in a letter from Daniel Creel to a cousin in Ohio dated December of 1886. Jonas's son was the child legally, but with Prudence for more than 3 years had all 4 brothers been maintaining their rotation schedule. A matter of speculation rather than certainty was which of them had actually fathered the infant. Feelings he hadn't anticipated as Daniel's letter shows him wrestling with. A desire to know whether the child carried his blood alongside a recognition that asking such questions would destroy the unified front the brothers had maintained since establishing their household. This exact scenario had been addressed by the brothers' original planning documents discovered in the 1947 trunk find with characteristic practicality. To all four brothers equally with full inheritance rights to the undivided property would all children born to Prudence be considered legitimate heirs. Any brother from claiming biological primacy or seeking to establish exclusive paternal rights was specifically prohibited by the agreement. As a unified holding exactly as the brothers operated it themselves would the land pass to the next generation. How differently the four men would respond once an actual infant appeared rather than a theoretical future heir was what the planning documents hadn't anticipated. His conviction that the child resembled Silas more than the other brothers is revealed by Thomas's correspondence from this period, though he admitted such observations might be influenced by knowing one of them had to be the biological father. His legal satisfaction with being listed as the official parent regardless of biological reality is mentioned in Jonas's letters while simultaneously expressing uncertainty about what role the other brothers should play in the child's upbringing. Almost nothing about the birth in his surviving correspondence did Silas, the youngest brother, write. With the same practical efficiency he applied to farm management does he show him deflecting questions about resemblance and paternity in the few references that exist. That the Creel household had produced its first heir and that all four brothers would ensure the child received proper upbringing did he note simply in one letter to a former neighbor in Ohio. Whether this restraint reflected genuine indifference or careful avoidance of a topic he found uncomfortable remains unclear from the historical record. About paternity in her known correspondence did Prudence herself maintain careful silence. The birth is mentioned in the one letter written to her sister during this period, never sent and discovered decades later, but provides no hints about which brother she believed had fathered the child. On the relief of finally producing an heir after years of medical interventions and household tension was instead her focus. Both unanswerable and irrelevant to her position in the household did she consider the question of biological paternity, suggests the letter. That William was only the first is what the birth record and subsequent territorial census data reveal. A second child in 1888, a daughter named Ruth, did Prudence give birth to. In 1890 arrived a third child, another son called Henry. A fourth, Margaret, came in 1892. Regular was the spacing, uncomplicated were the births according to available medical records, and as the legal father was Jonas consistently listed in the territorial documentation. But something the official records didn't capture began noting Valley residents who observed the growing Creel family. Remarkably similar features to each other did all four children bear. And pronounced resemblance to Silas specifically showed according to multiple contemporary accounts preserved in letters and newspaper social columns. The youngest Creel brothers' distinctive dark eyes and angular features appeared in each child as they matured while the other brothers' physical characteristics seemed absent from the next generation. Gradually over years rather than being immediately apparent at each birth did this observation pattern emerge. That would prove impossible to ignore had Valley gossip reached a consensus by the time Margaret was born in 1892, however. Whatever the legal fiction maintained and whatever the brothers' original agreement stipulated, only one of the four men was actually producing the heirs meant to secure the family's unified land claim. Visible in the faces of their children was becoming the biological reality that 19th-century medicine couldn't diagnose and that the Creole brothers had agreed not to investigate. A decidedly unequal genetic legacy was producing the household's careful equality. Actually a secret was never the Creel arrangement, but rather an understanding that Bitterroot Valley residents had collectively decided not to acknowledge officially, and exactly how that community silence was maintained is revealed by surviving correspondence. With remarkable frankness in private while maintaining careful public neutrality did Valley residents discuss the Creole household, as shown by letters exchanged between neighboring homesteaders during the late 1880s. A conversation at a church social where three women debated whether Prudence Creel's situation constituted voluntary arrangement or subtle captivity is described in a letter from Margaret Lindquist to her sister in Minnesota dated April of 1887. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. That the women reached no consensus, but agreed that without evidence of mistreatment, intervention would be inappropriate and potentially harmful to Prudence herself is revealed by Lindquist's letter. Another window into how the community processed information about the Creole household is provided by the Bitterroot Valley Gazette, a weekly newspaper serving the region. With studied casualness did social columns from 1888 through 1892 mention the Creole family. As parents without noting the 3 additional adult men residing in the household did birth announcements list Prudence and Jonas. The Creole brothers' farming innovations and cooperative work methods were praised by agricultural reports while avoiding any reference to their domestic arrangements. That certain topics would remain undiscussed in print, regardless of how thoroughly they were debated in private, was an understanding shared by editors and readers, suggests the newspaper's coverage. Particularly notable was how the community's collective discretion functioned across different social contexts. A productive farming operation with appropriate improvements and livestock holdings was described in reports filed by the territorial tax assessor who visited the Creole property annually. The unusual household composition was never mentioned in his notes despite the fact that all 4 brothers were present during his visits. As members in good standing did the circuit preacher who occasionally conducted services at a valley schoolhouse record the Creole family, noting their regular attendance and financial contributions without addressing questions about their marriage arrangement. A social buffer that protected the Creole household from official scrutiny while allowing valley residents to maintain their own moral judgments was created by this pattern of public neutrality combined with private awareness. His discomfort with the Creole situation alongside his acknowledgement that the brothers were honest in business dealings and caused no trouble beyond their unconventional domestic life is described in a letter to his brother in Wisconsin in 1889 by a homesteader named Robert Carmichael. The pragmatic calculation many frontier communities made when faced with behavior that violated conventional morality but didn't threaten community stability is captured by Carmichael's letter. Economic productivity appears to have been the key factor in the valley's tolerance. One of the most successful farms in the region was operated by the Creole brothers, several seasonal workers were employed, and their debts were paid promptly. Results that 4 separate bachelor operations could never have achieved were produced by their cooperation. Stability and success was represented by the Creole household in a territory where crop failures and financial collapse were constant threats. Even if the methods producing that success violated traditional marriage norms, did geographic isolation reinforce community discretion? From a courthouse 60 miles distant did the nearest territorial marshal operate, and only twice yearly when weather permitted did he make rounds through Bitterroot Valley. Their own systems for managing behavior that fell into moral gray areas did valley residents develop without regular law enforcement presence. In inspiring calculated tolerance wasn't the Creole arrangement unique. Other households operating under unusual circumstances that valley residents acknowledged privately while declining to report officially are mentioned in correspondence from the era. That frontier communities often prioritized practical stability over moral absolutism is what the historical record suggests. Adequately housed, fed, and treated with reasonable respect when encountered in valley social situations appeared prudence. Healthy and properly cared for seemed the children born to the household. Productive operations that contributed to regional economic health were maintained by the brothers. These observable facts apparently outweighed concerns about the intimate arrangements producing them. But limits that remained largely untested during the Creole household's first decade did community tolerance have. As long as it remained stable and produced no obvious victims requiring intervention did valley residents accept the situation. That their discretion depended on the arrangement continuing to function without public scandal or evidence of serious harm is implicitly understood by residents, show letters from the period. Careful public behavior that gave the community no reason to withdraw its tacit acceptance was maintained by the Creole brothers and prudence for their part. For 8 years under this system of mutual discretion had the Creole household existed by 1890. The valley knew. The valley talked. But not to act also chose the valley. And that choice reflected frontier pragmatism that valued economic contribution and absence of obvious harm over strict adherence to conventional domestic morality. Eventually would that careful equilibrium collapse, but not from community pressure. From outside the valley, from territorial authorities who didn't share the local population's pragmatic tolerance for arrangements that served economic survival, even when they violated social convention, would the threat come. 90 years too late to change her story came the discovery of Prudence Creole's own words. But voice to the woman who had remained silent in every official record of the arrangement finally gave the document found tucked into a family Bible in 1972. A folded letter pressed between the pages of Psalms was found by a descendant cleaning out an estate in Billings who opened the leather-bound Bible that had belonged to Prudence. Yellowed had the paper but the ink remained legible. To Prudence's sister Catherine in Pennsylvania was the letter addressed and dated March of 1889, more than 6 years after Prudence had married Jonas Creel. Never sent was the letter. Whether Prudence had lost her nerve, reconsidered the wisdom of putting certain truths in writing, or simply never found a way to mail it without the brothers' knowledge remains unknown. 10 pages of careful handwriting that revealed the internal life of a woman whose public existence had been entirely defined by 4 men's economic calculations was what survived. With an apology for not writing sooner did the letter open, then immediately addressed what Prudence assumed Catherine already knew through family gossip. That she lived with 4 brothers, that she was legally married to one while maintaining relations with all of them, and that this arrangement had been clearly explained to her before she accepted the proposal did she confirm. A plea for rescue was not what followed, but a detailed explanation of why she had chosen this unconventional life over her available alternatives. With remarkable clarity about her situation after her first husband's death did Prudence write. Debt she couldn't pay and skills that Frontier Montana didn't value had left her with the timber accident that killed him. Read, write, and manage household accounts could she, but into paid employment in a territory where women's work consisted primarily of serving male relatives didn't those abilities translate. Limited to finding another husband quickly, working in circumstances she didn't specify but implied were degrading, or accepting charity from her family back east, which would require admitting failure and living indefinitely as a dependent relative, were her options, as she described them. Something her other options did not have the Creel proposal offered, wrote Prudence. Security with clearly defined terms. The negotiations that led to her acceptance did she describe, emphasizing the provisions she had insisted upon. Without interference would she control all household decisions. Financial compensation would she receive if she chose to leave. Legal protection as Jonas's wife would she have while maintaining practical authority over domestic operations. Of employment with unusual job requirements, not the terms of captivity, were these, she argued. Prudence's frank discussion of the psychological aspects of the arrangement was what made the letter particularly revealing. As a management problem requiring careful emotional calibration, not as romantic in any sense, did she describe the rotation system. Different temperaments, different expectations, different ways of interpreting her attention or lack thereof did each brother have. Deference to his titular authority expected Jonas, as the eldest and legal husband. That the rotation didn't diminish his status required reassurance Daniel. That he contributed equally to the household success needed periodic validation Thomas. With the practical nature of the arrangement seemed most comfortable and least interested in emotional complications did Silas, the youngest. Constant attention to perceived slights, careful distribution of her time and energy, and strategic deployment of the household authority they had granted her demanded maintaining equilibrium among 4 men, wrote Prudence. While ensuring none of the men felt their particular week mattered less than the others was it as performing 4 separate marriages simultaneously she described it. In ways that had nothing to do with physical labor was the work exhausting. With notable directness did the letter also address the question of children. That after the medical interventions failed to produce a pregnancy, she had begun to suspect the problem wasn't hers, despite what Dr. Thornley insisted, wrote Prudence. That conception finally occurred after more than 3 years of the rotation, which suggested to her that probability rather than medical treatment had eventually produced results, did she note. The children's resemblance to Silas did she mention without explicitly stating that she believed him to be their biological father. But in her careful phrasing was clear the implication. A kind of resigned practicality about choices she had made under constrained circumstances was what emerged most powerfully from Prudence's letter, neither contentment nor misery. That she didn't love any of the 4 brothers, but had developed respect for their consistent treatment of her within the terms they had negotiated, did she write. That outsiders would view her situation as degrading, while arguing that degradation was a luxury judgment made by people with better options than she had ever possessed, did she acknowledge. What Prudence imagined Catherine's response would be did the letter's final section address horror, pity, judgment. That she didn't want rescue because rescue meant returning to dependence without authority or security, wrote Prudence. Something conventional marriage often didn't might violate conventional morality, but gave her the Creole arrangement, explicit terms, defined power, and compensation for her contribution. By contract rather than sentiment functioned the household she lived in, and that clarity to the ambiguous dependencies most frontier women navigated did she prefer. Without signature or closing ended the letter, as though Prudence had simply stopped writing mid-thought. Whether she intended to finish it later or recognized that no conclusion would make the letter sendable remains speculation. Something the historical record had entirely lacked was what the document provided, Prudence Creel's own assessment of the bargain she had made and why she considered it, if not ideal, then at least preferable to her realistic alternatives in 1880s Montana Territory. From 5 to 8 years old ranged the 4 Creole children by 1891, and what those features revealed about which brother had actually fathered them could no longer Valley residents politely ignore as their physical features had become detailed enough. With increasing frequency as the children reached ages where their faces showed adult characteristics in miniature did the observations appear in private correspondence. How all 4 children shared the same distinctive dark eyes, angular jawline, and particular way of holding their heads when listening was described in a letter from Emma Vaughan to her cousin in Oregon dated August of 1891 about seeing the Creole family at a Valley gathering and being struck by. Nowhere in Jonas, Daniel, or Thomas appeared these features, but unmistakably present in Silas, the youngest brother, did Emma note. Similar observations during this period did other Valley residents record. About watching Prudence shop while accompanied by her children, and noticing how the youngest, Margaret, tilted her head at exactly the angle Silas used when examining merchandise, wrote to his brother the storekeeper in Stevensville, where the Creole family purchased supplies monthly. Attending a church social where William, the eldest child, stood near all 4 Creole brothers and appeared to be looking at 3 strangers and one obvious blood relative was described by a neighboring homesteader named Jacob Reinhardt. That they came from people with no medical training, attempting to describe something they understood instinctively, even if they couldn't explain it scientifically, was what made these observations particularly significant. As a field of study didn't exist 19th-century genetics. Obscure botanical research that wouldn't gain widespread recognition until the early 1900s remained Mendel's pea plant experiments. But for millennia had humans been observing family resemblances, and generations of accumulated folk knowledge about how children tended to favor certain parents in appearance did Valley residents possess. Across all 4 children, despite their birth spanning 6 years, did the resemblance pattern appear consistent. The same features as Ruth, born in 1888, Henry in 1890, and Margaret in 1892 did William, born in 1886, show. That all 4 children shared biological parentage rather than representing different brothers' offspring was suggested to observers by this consistency. Entirely in one man had instead concentrated the rotation system that was supposed to distribute reproductive success equally. That the brothers themselves were aware of what the children's appearances indicated is suggested by correspondence from the era. A revealing passage about accepting that nature didn't honor agreements men made about equity is contained in a letter from Thomas Creel to a former Ohio neighbor dated November of 1891. For all brothers to share equally in the next generation had been the original plan, but a different outcome that none of them could control or change had biological reality produced, wrote Thomas. Resigned rather than angry was his tone, suggesting the brothers had reached some internal understanding about the situation. More frustration shows Daniel's correspondence from this period. That he had invested years in an arrangement that was producing heirs for Silas while leaving the other 3 brothers as uncles rather than fathers did he write about feeling in a letter to the same Ohio contact from January of 1892. The fundamental purpose of their shared marriage, creating a unified next generation with equal stake in the property, was violated by this, noted Daniel. A situation where one brother's descendants would inherit while the others remained childless regardless of how many years they had participated in the rotation had been created instead by the genetics that 19th-century medicine couldn't diagnose. Whether Prudence and Silas had discussed the paternity question between themselves remains unclear from the historical record. That she suspected Silas was the biological father was suggested by her unsent letter from 1889, but no indication of whether she had shared that suspicion with him did it provide. On the topic did Silas's own correspondence maintain careful silence, neither confirming nor denying what Valley observers had concluded. Of the complexity surrounding their parentage appeared unaware the children themselves. As family did they refer to all four men according to accounts from neighbors who observed their interactions. In formal contexts did William call Jonas father, but equally comfortable with all the brothers seemed. As a unified family unit continued operating the household, even as the genetic truth beneath that unity became increasingly apparent to outside observers. When Margaret was born and displayed the same unmistakable features as her older siblings, had Valley consensus solidified by 1892. One wife and raise all children as communal heirs had agreed to share four men. Other plans had biology. Reproductively successful was only one brother, and anything but equal was the genetic legacy produced by the household's careful egalitarianism. When external pressures eventually forced the Creole arrangement into public scrutiny, would this observation have significant consequences? Harder to maintain became the fiction that all four brothers held equal parental status once anyone looking at the children could see which brother had actually fathered them. The biological evidence written in their children's faces couldn't be overridden by the agreement the brothers had made. From the territorial courthouse in Helena arrived a letter at the Creole homestead in February of 1892. And with federal pressure to standardize Montana's domestic practices before statehood was about to collide the decade of community discretion that had protected the family's arrangement. To the territorial bench just 6 months earlier had Judge Lawrence Whitfield been appointed with a specific mandate from Washington: identify and resolve irregular marriage situations that violated federal standards for acceptable domestic arrangements. Demonstrating that territorial residents lived according to conventional family structures rather than the frontier improvisations that had flourished during decades of minimal federal oversight was required by Montana's application for statehood. Through investigation and when necessary prosecution was Whitfield's assignment to bring compliance. That Whitfield began his review by examining marriage licenses issued over the previous 15 years, cross-referencing them with census data and property records, is shown by court records preserved in the Montana Historical Society archives. Immediately attracted his attention did the Creole household. Jonas and Prudence listed the marriage license, but as joint owners showed four brothers the property deed. One married couple living with 3 additional adult males and 4 children documented census records from 1890. Improvements suggesting a household significantly larger than a typical frontier couple would require were described by tax assessments. That he received reports about the Creole arrangement from multiple sources during spring of 1892 is revealed by Whitfield's investigative notes discovered among his personal papers donated to the Historical Society in 1958. Unusual household composition during a routine visit was mentioned by a territorial revenue inspector. That mail addressed to the Creole property listed all four brothers' names was noted by the postmaster in Stevensville. Conversations with Valley residents who described domestic arrangements he considered morally questionable were reported by a traveling preacher. To Bitterroot